welcome to the Monopath podcast. I'm speaking with Simon Constantine today, who is one half of Gorilla Perfumes, who many of you will know from Lush, the cosmetics company, who I work for as well. There were some time constraints on this, so we kept it short, but I don't think that was at the expense of a good conversation, which was really my priority here. It was actually quite a wide-ranging subject of things that we got into, notably including some things that podcast listeners by this point should be familiar with. So the brain hemispheres and the relationship between the two of them. Actually, in the middle of the conversation, I remembered where I first heard about Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who I've referenced a couple of times in earlier conversations. It was actually on the Lush Player. There's an interview with him, which I highly recommend you go and watch if you can get a chance. Maybe I'll stick a link for that in the description for this too. That might be helpful. Anyway, that does come up in the podcast, as often tends to be the case, undergirding everything else that we're talking about when it comes to creativity. We do dive a little into the relationship between family and creativity, which entails something to do with nature and nurture, and how much of creative thought is learned and how much of it is just simply identical to who you are. But I'll leave the list at that. So Simon's main vocation is in fragrance development. He is the nose. And so part of this conversation will appeal to big fans of Lush or people who are really into the history of the company. We speak a little bit about Breath of God, one of the fairly well-received, or one of the most well-received fragrances associated with Lush, as well as his new project, which is Ånd Fragrances, and with a little and spelt with a Danish A, which looks something like the letter A with a little circle above it, almost as if you could hang the letter from the door. Anyway, I'll stick that link in the description for this too. And other than that, I'll leave you to the conversation. One point just to add before I do, something I usually have to say, I'm obligated to as the host of this podcast, is that if you do want to support it, there are two ways that you can really help. But only do that if you've really got something out of the conversation, if you are really enjoying what you hear. The first of those ways is to leave a review on iTunes. If it's not a 5-star, don't do it. I'll fight you. The alternative is to simply buy some tea from Arthur Dove Tea Co. You get some tea then as well, some loose leaf tea. And it really does help keep me doing this podcast and having interesting conversations with creative people. So feel free to do that at your own leisure. Anyway, I said I would leave you to it. So without further fuss, I bring you Simon Constantine. Well, Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining me. I appreciate your time is sacred, so we'll get to it and we'll dive straight in. One of the things that I was really interested to get to with you was family and family's relationship to creativity, because you are somebody who, if people aren't familiar with your work, who has grown up in a fairly creative environment, I think. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and it's only yesterday I was reflecting on when I was a kid, my mum using the shed for inventions for all sorts of products. It was actually, I saw somebody was releasing a line of shampoo bars, and I remember back that when I was a kid, 30 plus years ago, I remember mum inventing that in the sheds, and then over the summer, that was my job, pressing shampoo bars.
All right, really? So
having sort of creativity around the house, and quite strange creativity, like cosmetic production and soaps and all of that kind of stuff was quite normal. So yeah.
Your speciality being fragrance, you're one half of for the Gorilla Perfumes, the gorilla in question, as I understand it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So that was that whole project really, because at the moment we're sort of on hold because of stepped out and I'm working on Ånd Fragrance at the minute. But with Gorilla, that was quite a big creative experiment. I would say it was an experiment because it was an interesting sort of thing to attempt. And again, that was working with my dad quite a lot. In the labs, we'd sort of come up with these sort of harebrained schemes and then translate them into fragrance. And then they became kind of more than that, I think, once they were put into the hands of some of the creative team at Lush. And we ended up with sort of art gallery installations of different fragrances and shows and everything from music to film to photography to, it's always been quite an exciting process. That
there's always been, to me as an outsider at least, there's always seemed like there's a big blurring of boundaries between what is usually taken as quite discrete, separate phenomena, like sound over here and taste over here, but you're kind of blending those lines a little bit, and it seems like you're doing something. I mean, I resonate with it because this is what I do with my own tea company, and I have songs that taste like tea, and I hadn't realised before. I mean, I work at Lush now, and I've worked there. I'm in my 4th year now, and I hadn't realised when I started doing the teas that was a thing that Lush did with the spa treatments. Is the thing that really stuck out for me in the first instance. But there is that blurring of boundaries between where the music ends and where, say, a scent or a taste begins that I think is interesting to play around with.
Yeah, I think the spa is a good place because the first treatment was a synesthesia treatment. And that creativity was happening around the same sort of time. I don't think it was exactly the same time, but there was a period within the company where a lot of these kind of projects initiated. And I think spa would be in that same category and that probably represents it best with that synesthesic kind of approach where it's blended. It was taking these individual components that have been discrete. Like you say, you've got the music world and it exists over here, and then you have fine art and it exists there, and actually kind of throwing all that away a little bit and saying what happens when you bring all those elements together. And Gorilla was very much like that. Some of the other work I was involved with at the same sort of time. And so this is a strange parallel, but a lot of work on the Sustainable Lush Fund that's become Refund. And there was this sort of holistic look at, where does fair trade, organic, all these different discrete elements actually come together into something that becomes more exciting and more dynamic and kind of, and so I feel like there was a particular sort of Cambrian bloom of opportunities within the company at that point in time. So Spa is a good example of that, where you have that, you've got the physical treatment, which is what most people would just be focused on. But then you had, this orchestrated music that encompassed, and I remember with the synesthesia treatment, they actually took noises in the room and then brought them into the music. So the musician Simon Emerson and his team, they worked with some of the elements that were happening around you. So the blurring between the physical and this sort of recorded orchestra made it a complete synesthesic experience. Do you think I should explain what synesthesia is or not?
Well, probably not to a degree. I have something like it anyway, so listeners to the podcast will have heard me talk a little bit about it before. I don't know if I have it the same way as others do, and I don't know if you know how I have it, but I just, everything seems to have a sensation of colour, but it's not a visual thing for me whatsoever. It's just, there is a feeling of redness and greenness and blueness. So taking the synesthesia treatment as a good example, when I had that treatment, I remember a particular moment in it in the last quarter, I think it was, where there was some electric pianos, and electric pianos have always felt kind of like an aqua light blue to me. And I don't know what that means, but they've always felt like an aqua light blue. And in the treatment at the time, the lights in the room were a different colour. And there was like an unusual distance for there, like not a discomfort, but a dissonance that was It was just something worthy of note, I think, in the treatment for me. I think in most people's experience of synesthesia, though, there tends to be something more visual, especially in the kind when it's colour and music. I mean, do you know anybody with synesthesia?
Well, other than sort of self-diagnosing yourself with synesthesia, and I think when I've been talking with Dad and when we were talking about with Simon Emerson, for instance, as a musician and stuff, the more you talk to people, the more you realise quite a lot of people have some form of it. Whether that translates into a creative act or not is something different again. But for me, I think I have it in different terms as well. Sometimes it's shapes and colours, but sometimes if I've been really into a lot of creative work with perfumery, I've been to gigs and watched musicians play, and then you immediately, it's very easy to identify notes and smells that would be going with the music.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen, and it's kind of, it's just, I don't know, it's like everything gets put in this melting pot. And if you don't fight against it too much and make sense of it, you end up with this sort of quite incredible cacophony of weird things going on.
Yeah, well, it's this vagueness, isn't it? It's like there's a vague just sense of it feeling like there's a connection between, let's say, a piece of music and a taste or a smell, and it just has a feeling of like, this fits. I mean, this does make sense, and I completely agree. When I talk about synesthesia, I usually am of the mind that everybody has it to some degree, because people resonate with things like, I mean, advertising and branding and danger signs being read, all of these sort of things. There's some kind of truth to it that it seems fairly pervasive and perennial. We're kind of stuck with it, I think.
Yeah, no, I think actually when you look at it, it's sort of unnatural to think of things like the written language. I think people with dyslexia, for instance, and stuff, it makes a lot of sense to me that the human mind struggles, because those linear forms of, right, this is what you see, and you put all that together. If you didn't have those constructs, how would your mind work, and how would it be creative?
Exactly.
How would it just naturally exist? So I think
that's one of the things that I really like about some of your work and some of Lush's work more broadly, is that it does seem to kind of get this whole rather than the parts, in the sense that instead of just saying this is just about the scent, say with fragrance, it's not just about the scent. There's other elements going on in it. The fact that it's being tied into other sensations actually just makes more sense from a kind of from the point of view of an individual. Like, I don't have just one sense. I can focus on my vision and what I see, or my smell and what I'm picking up on. But actually, all of them are in play all of the time. And I feel like if the focus is just on, let's say, what I'm smelling, then all of the other senses that I'm experiencing are distracting me from that one thing, or vice versa. Whereas in something like a synesthesia treatment, there's the kind of that unity of parts that makes the treatment, I don't know, it feels more wholesome, all encompassing, unavoidable.
Yeah. And I think that's the nice thing about fragrance as well, is that you can, the other aspect with creative work and fragrance is you can bypass a lot of the more well-trodden senses. So I think that this compartmentalizing, so you're used to being visually kind of assaulted, if you like, with advertising, with everything that's going on. People know how to use and to manipulate images. And then with sound, that's also something that's become increasingly polluted. There's lots and lots of noise and things. But the thing with fragrance is that even if you've built up a bit of a barrier, if you like, emotionally, maybe to be connected to visual things or to sound, with fragrance, it goes straight in through the olfactory bulb and into your sort of hippocampus in your brain, and triggers an emotional response pretty much before you can stop it. There's no interface. It literally hit, the smell hit your nose and goes straight to that part of, the emotional parts of your brain.
Yeah.
And I find that quite exciting, because you can, if you do it right and you play the right tune, you can have quite an impact on someone, and you can really connect them through however you'd like to connect them, whether it's through storytelling and kind of that, or whether it's just through a pure emotion. Fragrance is quite exciting in that way.
So for you, as a composer of fragrances, do you tend to begin with this like feeling or emotion or narrative, or is there some other place that fits in?
It's an interesting mix, because you've got this, it's almost left brain, right brain kind of mix, where you've got some of the analytical sort of scientific side to fragrance, which you need to know. It's just a sort of skill level, the same as any a musician or any, you need to understand that. But the interesting thing is the way I think I've been taught, and the way maybe Dad approaches it, is that you're not bound by that particularly. I think if you were in a more conventional company creating fragrances, you would then, that'd probably be all you did. You would analyze, go through line by line and create these sort of very structured formulae that are based on previous work, blah, blah, blah. But for the sort of work I do, I'm not trained in that way. I understand some of the basics, but I'm not overly trained. So it gives you this sort of freedom of creativity where you can feel things and go with a sort of sentiment, or how you're feeling. So the last the 5 fragrances I've worked on and were really about this overwhelming sense of and this is before COVID and all of that, but this overwhelming sense of need for reassurance for the future and offering something kind of positive. And a lot of it is about, actually, they're quite comforting smells, because I really felt like I needed that, and I felt like humanity needed it. And somebody just to go, it's going to be all right. Do you know what I mean? Calm down a bit, because the more fractious everybody is, the less likely we are to see ourselves through this in a positive way. So, and of course, it's just fragrance. So I'm not expecting these are going to sort the world out. It's just that was my, and that was almost my subconscious really stepping forward and doing that at that point, which is kind of annoying, because sometimes you're trying to do something else technically, and then I don't know if you experience it with your work, but you're trying to go left, and then your subconscious gets in the driving seat and goes, no, we're doing this. And then you're like, okay, great.
Totally. I think most people would describe that as writer's block sometimes as well. And they would say that, it's the same kind of thing, a little different perhaps, but writer's block is a similar kind of thing in that, you end up getting in your own way. I like that you spoke about the different hemispheres. I actually had forgotten until we start this conversation, really, that I actually stumbled into the work of Dr. Ian McGilchrist through the Lush player. Never heard of him before, and was interested in the brain and neurology anyway. And I've very recently finished his book, which was like a 2-year project for me to.
Right, yeah, I've not managed to get the end of that. Yeah.
Yeah, apparently he's writing another one and is nearly done with that, and it's longer. So. Fantastic news. But really the aim of this podcast is to do the work of putting right hemisphere practices into terms that the left hemisphere can understand, which is what his book is trying to do, and I think successfully does too. And actually getting value from that, because it being able to communicate some of these things that sometimes we take for granted because they're usually just left to the subtext. I think it's just an important part of the creative process. I've started going back to make music maybe in the last month or so, like that, and I found it so much different since I started thinking about the philosophy of art, in being able to talk about it with my producer. And when he's trying to establish an instruction, I can kind of pass that and make sense of what he's sometimes trying to say in right hemisphere terms, because I've gone through the work of laboring and going, this is how to do it in the left hemisphere. I just wanted to say that, but what we were talking about was writer's block. And I've had that many times. I'd be interested to know what your approach is to get away from it. Mine is simply to leave it. If I follow the right hemisphere in a sense and my impulses, and if I know that I have to do something, I'll do it. I'll do it to some degree, but I think I must have developed some intuition of knowing when I'm pushing too hard and knowing when to break off. And I think that's probably the key criteria in creativity, is just knowing when you've pushed too hard with one hemisphere or the other. Do you have a different way of doing things?
No, I think it's very like that. I think you have to sort of, timing seems to be everything, and your sort of logical brain doesn't necessarily know when that time is. But I think your subconscious takes the temperature quite often, and is like, right, and you can sort of feel it. And if you're doing it right, everything comes together, and it's quite, I wouldn't say simple, but it happens. And if you're lucky, you get into a flow of things, and the time spent in between those episodes, you can't get angry. I do get angry. I'm very impatient and I get quite frustrated, but I try. My advice would be, don't get angry, but and there's going to be a lot of failed experiments. So I think either you do nothing and you busy yourself with something else, or you just keep turning up, which is another piece of advice. I think was one of those TED Talks on genius, I think, which is the genius visits you not the other way around. You're not a genius. You know, you get moments that it feels like you're visited by whatever it might be, and the only way of making sure you capture that is to be present enough, you know, and to be practicing. So I think there's an element of continual development. I know that sometimes with my fragrances, for instance, the final products don't take very long in a creative kind of burst. Sometimes it can be as little as 45 minutes playing with things and putting it all together. But if I track back the length of time it took to get to those 45 minutes, it could be 2 years of experiments and playing with this and putting these together. Yeah. And one thing, because I like to draw, and I went to art college, and I enjoy kind of visual arts as well, but I don't find it nearly as free form as fragrance, and as nearly as creative a space for me as perfumery. I feel like when I start drawing, it's got to look a certain way, and I get very illustrative, and I get quite, restricted with it. Whereas with perfume, the sense of play, where you can just, I'll just put those things together, and it doesn't matter if it's a mess. I'll put it to one side, and I'll do something else. That I've really enjoyed, and it sort of liberated me a bit to push the boundaries, I think. So having a sense of play, and then all of a sudden realizing that you're delivering some things, we go, oh, actually, that's quite good to keep hold of that.
Yeah. What would you, just going kind of off the back of what you said, talking about like it being like a play, you're in a play state and it feeling quite free and fluid. You mentioned like a failed experiment. What exactly to you is a failed experiment? Just to clarify, I think for a lot of people, a failed experiment is something that has no beneficial outcome, or they've got a goal that hasn't been met. I get the sense that might not be the case for you.
I don't really. It's a fine line between pretending to yourself that you've never made any mistakes, which I definitely have, but then actually knowing that they're just different iterations of something that could come good. Do you know what I mean? So I guess it's a case of, when do you give up? And there's certain things that, I haven't maybe given up yet on a lot of stuff. So the mistakes, I think, are still going to pay out at some point. Yeah. Even if it's a sense of sort of trial and error to a certain degree. There's little roads that you won't go back down again, but you've done, and you know that works that way. And it's sort of, I think, I'm hoping that I'm becoming more efficient, and wasting less of my energy and time over, after sort of 15, 20 years of doing that kind of work. But I mean, you never know that, do you? But I quite enjoy not worrying too much about that stuff. It does still affect you when you've made a mistake and it doesn't work the way you hoped it would. But the right attitude, I find, is that you can just put that down as an experience that you can reference later.
Yeah, well, I think people who find that they struggle with creativity or being creative, or people who have failed experiments and feel beaten up by it, probably are forgetting that it's a creative process. And it's continuous. It hasn't ended. I mean, many of what I would perceive to be my own failed experiments, let's say if it's a piece of music or a song, I might develop an idea to some point that seemed great when I first had it and just doesn't really go anywhere, and maybe it fizzles out. But then I'll find that I keep returning to either that idea or others very similar to it, and eventually I kind of take bits that I liked from all of them and make this amalgam of various different things that have happened to make something new. So I don't really look at it as a failed experiment, because it implies some kind of punctuation, like there's some kind of finality there that I don't experience. It's just a never-ending flow, and I think you just got to live with it.
I definitely agree, both with the returning to themes. It's almost, you almost bore yourself. You go, oh, am I doing this again? Like, have I really got? Is this all I'm about? I kind of imagine that you have all these doors of opportunity that are open to you, and you still pick the same kind of bit. But quite often, I agree. You start going down that road, and actually, probably by the time you're finished, so you're. In fact, when I'm creating perfume, it feels like an album. It feels like you're compiling a series of songs, and that was one of the analogies we used with Gorilla. Just one release of perfume, but we had sort of 10, if you like. And for me, by the time you're finished, maybe that first theme has disappeared completely, but it started you off. And then you've got, like you say, components of it or bits and pieces of kind of fallen by the wayside, but it got you started. And so you shouldn't fight that either.
Yeah. Have you had a recent example of anything like that at all? I mean, is there a fragrance that you've been working on that you've kind of, it's been a bit of a labor of love?
I think that, well, actually, the first fine fragrance was Breath of God, was probably the example that I sort of set myself, if you like, because I had been working on that for quite some time without knowing it and knowing it. I've been playing with these accords, and then I actually I'd left Lush. This is 2006 or 2005, 2006. So I had this concept of Breath of God. I'd read about kind of incense and pheromones and pheromones in human breath that mimicked frankincense and myrrh and things that are traditionally used in church services, and I found that quite interesting. I talked to Dad about it. Then I'd gone to Tibet. I'd seen incense pyres and kind of been inside temples and stuff, and then I came back, and there was it's probably about a 2-year process where I really, at certain points, I just completely abandoned it. And, I was like, that's not going to happen, and I didn't, and then all of a sudden, in a very short space of time, all the experiments and things suddenly came together into something that's quite unique. And then it's a case of knowing that that's happened and not fiddling too much with it and going, okay, that's finished. And that's the other. Yeah. Then you've got a discipline there where you go, no, don't do anything else. That's it.
Yeah, well, Breath of God's a very highly praised fragrance of yours as well. I don't know if that'd be true to say that it's the most well praised or if it's the most well received.
Yeah, well, it depends who you talk to. The first review I ever had for perfume was from a lady journalist who, I can't remember where she worked, but she said, I've smelled the Breath of God and it smells foul. And then there was this huge thing where she likened it to Sex Panther from Anchorman. Yeah. So it depends who you talk to about the fragrance, whether it's acclaimed or not. But that was the first review. I think pretty much the second review was from Luca Turin and Tanya Sanchez, the Perfumes Guide, and they're one of the only kind of couples really producing high quality perfumery reviews and critiques. So Luca Turin, I think, gave it 5 stars, which obviously then I've never stopped mentioning. It's been something that I bring up in most conversations. So that, and then we haven't. I don't think Dad or I have managed to get another 5-star fragrance past him yet. So I'm quite happy that's done so well.
It's interesting as well because I feel like with the creative progress, there's this march of unknowing. Like you spend all of your time kind of not really knowing where you're going, but knowing in some sense that it's the right way to go. I've described it on the podcast before as feeling like you're in a familiar but not lit room and kind of having to get your way around it despite not being able to see anything. And eventually you kind of, you're sensing your way through it. But that's how I feel about creation. I mean, that seems to resonate with your story there as well.
I don't know if you've ever, say if you've had a break from making music or flavors or whatever, and it might only be a couple of weeks, it could be a few months that you go without really picking up your tools and playing with it and stuff. And then when you come to the sort of plate, if you like, I've done it lots of times. You go into the lab, you look at all the bottles, and you go, I haven't got a clue what any of these things do. I don't know how they fit together. I don't know why I even thought I could do this. It's almost like starting completely from scratch. Like it might as well be, I don't know, complete gobbledygook. And then you start to pick things back up and the process starts again. But the sort of feeling of a clean slate, if you like, and that you kind of, maybe you don't remember and you don't know what you're doing. It's quite reassuring, weirdly. I think there's definitely, like you say, a familiar room, you're bumping into the table and kicking the chairs and they can't quite find everything.
Yeah, to me, it's the difference between finding and making. Making would be the presumption that you actually know what's there all along and you're just kind of creating it from a blueprint. Whereas finding it as if it is there somewhere, but you're not quite sure where.
I don't know, because you're asking these questions a lot, I guess, to people. I get asked a lot. I think I get asked a lot about creativity just by sort of, average Joe sort of thing. And the answer they want is, I had this idea, I went in and I made it with these things, and this is the end result. And when you don't give them that answer, you can see them glaze over and just be like, oh God, it's not very easy. And then sort of lose interest in your answer, because I think people would love it to be a straight line. You go, idea in, creativity happens here with your skills and materials equals end product. And I don't find that happens very often.
Yeah. Well, with the hemispheres thing, I guess it's a case of, the right hemisphere doing most of the work and the left hemisphere just can't understand it. It doesn't understand this whole.
Yeah, I think that, we're going back to Ian McGilchrist. The thing I liked about his, it was the RSA anime I watched first, and then we made that film. Matt Shaw made the film with Ian, and it was such an interest, which you don't have linguistics in that right part. It struggles for a sort of an actual voice. Again, we're so attuned to either the written language or to vocalization of ideas that we forget that a huge amount of our evolution has been without those tools, and yet we still expressed ourselves and still communicated and connected with other beings, if you like, if we were thinking back in terms of evolution and where your brain has evolved from. So relying on those tools and then diminishing others is dangerous. And I think that perfume is a very interesting thing to use as a language to talk to people. And the same with music. I think it's the same with a lot of kind of expressive acts. Is people sort of say, what are you trying to say? And I'm like, well, that's it. That the fragrance is what I'm trying to say, because I can't say it the other way. If I could say it the other way, I wouldn't make the bloody perfume. You know what I mean?
Exactly. I've heard that. I can't remember if I'm not going to spoil the second half of the book that you haven't read yet, but I've heard it mentioned elsewhere that there's a difference between different kinds of truths, there being a literal truth and a metaphorical truth, which I quite like that distinction. And I think roughly in the latter half of Ian McGilchrist's book, it is going into this diminishment of metaphorical truth, as if everything has to be literally true, and if it isn't, it's devalued and not seen as relevant. But most of us actually understand on an intuitive level that has deeper meaning, and it means almost more than what is literally true. But then the way we speak about it suggests that we don't know it. So it's that kind of weird knowledge thing again, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it starts to become this sort of fake news, doesn't it? It's like, oh no, that doesn't exist because I can, you can't prove that kind of stuff. And it's not anti-proving anything, but the fact that you have that sensation and that feeling, you can't discount that. And I think maybe going, like with writer's block and things, if you're starting to deny that part of yourself, an avenue to express itself, I think it's quite dangerous. I think it just that is where things start to bottle up, and you can't. Well, certainly for me, I feel like the creative process, if I ignore it, if I said, for instance, I'm never going to do that again, I know that within a probably quite a short space of time, it would be knocking on the door, that part of me, and it would be wanting to come in and play. Do you know what I mean? And it wouldn't go away, and I'd just be fighting it. So, yeah.
Do you feel in that case that, this was one of the questions I'd hoped to ask early on, and we just kind of got railroaded a little bit, but which is fine with me. Do you think that, you grow up in a family of creative people, like where do you think the role of nature nurture is? Do you think you were just born as somebody who is creative by virtue of the genetics that you happen to have, or was it cultivated in an environment that you're in, or both?
It was quite I think it must have been both. Like when you look at our upbringing, so creativity and imagination were fostered, so they were talked about a lot. We didn't have a television at home because it was deemed to be, bear in mind, mum and dad were quite into the sort of hippie movement at the point that we were born. So they had certain ideals that obviously translated into Lush with animal rights and non-animal testing and the use of natural materials and organic and all of those things. But we didn't have a TV at home. as part and parcel of this sort of weird thing, right? I say it's weird because what we used to do instead was sneak around our mates' houses and watch the A-Team and watch Rainbow after school, or, you know, and go somewhere else to do it. So it didn't actually work. But the point was, imagination was something that was talked about and sort of encouraged. And then we also had a lot of time of extremely boring things going on. For instance, because they were, you know, my mum and dad both working in the business, you'd end up playing in a factory in cardboard boxes for 3 hours after school, or you'd end up in, you know, or, and the other thing that they really enjoyed, bird watching. Bird watching is lovely, and I'm very, you know, I'm grateful for it now because it introduced me to the natural world and kind of, and the understanding of all of the environment and the importance of that. But I would also caveat that it was, again, one of the most boring hobbies for a small kid to be involved with, because you end up going to quite bleak places sometimes. Because, for instance, like rubbish tips are very good places to go bird watching. Yeah. Disused little grubby places at the back of a sewage farm, places with burnt out cars. And so a lot of time when I look back, yeah. So you were then, but being bored and being told to use your imagination, start to I think it meant that part of your mind wasn't cut off. It was sort of given a bit of free form. So I think that helped. But I also think that maybe your mind is, you know, your genetics play a part as well. I think that, for instance, I don't have a huge problem with imagination, and I dream a lot, and you know, I don't, you know, I think that sort of slightly altered states of consciousness thing that a lot of creative people lean on. For instance, a lot of people who've been, you know, worked with in the past talk about psychedelic drugs, and me personally, I've never gone down that route, and the reason is I sort of feel like I'm just about holding on as it is. I think if I was given an extra shove, I don't know whether I'd come back or what. So and I feel like, say, like the sound bath treatment for the spa, I had all sorts of strange visions throughout that. As soon as the Tibetan singing bowls started, I could see all kinds of things and felt like I was in a real trance-like state. So I think that maybe you've got I've probably got a trigger switch that's a little quicker than most people to go into those sort of zones a little bit.
Do you feel like, I mean, I suppose I'm speaking from my own point of view, but I just hoping to find a kindred spirit all the time on this podcast with people I'm speaking to. I feel like I can switch off. So I always feel like the flow of ideas is pretty intense and never ending. So I'm always having ideas. It's constant. And some people would say, oh, well, it's innovative, and, you know, you've always got something to say that's a bit unique and novel. So we're grateful for that. But for somebody who's experiencing it, there never seems to be a switch off point. And I think, coupled with me, I'm quite conscientious. So I'm always having to do something. So I do have a TV, but it doesn't get used all that much because I feel guilty after sitting there for an hour. I'm fidgety, I'm bored. I have to get up and go and do something that at the end of the day I can look back on and think, I did a thing today. Is that the same for you, or is there some kind of difference there?
If my wife takes the children off for the day and she knows that I'm left at home on my own, she sort of has a slight feeling of dread when she comes back, because I'm not one of those sort of people where I don't get increasingly bored. I have more and more ideas, and then I start acting on them. And if there's an extended period of time, say, I don't know what would happen if she left me on my own for 3 weeks, but I think that it would be quite a mess. And I think that there's a sort of stream of consciousness that is going on, and I think that the difficulty is being disciplined enough to land those ideas and be consistent and finish them off, more than it is actually having the idea. You know, I've got a constant list of, and it's not just with perfumes, it's with business, it's with all sorts of different things. It's sort of, you know, it grows and blooms out into all this kind of stuff. So I find that is, you know, like at the moment, I'm just a little way away from this walled garden project that I've been working on. for the last 12 months. And it's similar, you get into this bit and this bit, and all of it suddenly starts to grow, and then you find yourself, I do watch TV in the evenings, and it's mostly as a sort of very poor sedative, because the whole time I'm there going, right, and I just write a little note to do this later, and send a quick message and go, oh, I've just thought of that. So it doesn't really work. And the waking up in the middle of the sort of early hours in the morning is really irritating. I wrote a whole children's book over the course of about 6 months at between 3:30 and 5:30 in the morning for about 6 months just because I was like, this is annoying me. So I just wrote the thing.
Yeah, somebody's laughed at me before on the podcast. I did one with a friend, Rick Neal, who was my tutor at music college, and he laughed at me because I described ideas like a plague.
Yeah. They just creep in. Yeah, they're just creeping in, and if you don't wash your hands, you sort of start giving them to everyone else as well.
Yeah, I think you're right though. I think you've got to have that choosiness, and you've got to know which ones to pick, and you can't just chase them all with the same sort of passion that you would like to. Sometimes you need to also just wait for the right moment. I mean, that's how I've found things, like eventually with starting this podcast, which I only really began a few months ago in the middle of lockdown. It just started. I'd been thinking about it for years, and it just started feeling more and more unavoidable, really. It's like, okay, this is clearly the thing that I want to do, and it's like, I'm going to have to do it, because otherwise I'm going to drive myself up the wall.
I think that's where your sort of left braininess can kick in, can't it? You've got a nice framework then, where you go, you've got a series of technical things that you can do, and you know that you want a bit of a framework and a model. You go, okay, I'm going to be doing one of these every week, and then you can start pushing your creative things, because that's the other downside of just unbridled creativity, is that it's like a solar flare, and it can just burst off into all this energy. But if you don't direct it somewhere, it can do quite a bit of damage. I've also noticed.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally it for me. I at the moment I'm running a tea company, I'm making a record, I'm doing the podcast, and I'm working at Lush as well. I mean, and I'm doing a master's in philosophy. So you're gonna 5 kind of biggies there that I'm trying to do at the same time. Do you prefer to spin the plates like that, or do you prefer to pick one and go with it?
I'm terrible. Like I said, I left Lush about just over 12 months ago, pretty much, because I was like, right, okay, I've got a few ideas, and then within about 2 weeks, I've set up this garden project, which is quite a big undertaking. It's 3.5 acre walled garden that needs restoring back to its sort of 1880s sort of peak. But I want to incorporate modern challenges in that, climate change, resilience, permaculture, and all of these kind of things. So yeah, that's quite a juicy one, and I opened that up to the public and training. And then I was like, well, I've got these perfume ideas, so I made these perfumes, and I was like, and I got chatting to a friend of mine, and then we created this brand, basically, and fragrance, and all around similar subjects. It's all around, again, working with indigenous groups and supporting ecosystems, but that's quite exciting. And then on top of that, I kind of I've also been working with the Eden Project, guiding some of their, or just sort of consulting really on some of their project work that they want to do in a variety of different countries. So I've stacked in, probably it's ending up being like 3 separate businesses really. And those are the ones that I picked, and was quite disciplined to just stick to that. Yeah. I've overdone it.
Do you feel like you do them better though if you can just switch off from one and move to another?
Because I feel like you said, that downtime between maybe creativity, when you've got a nice patch of creative work, and when you haven't, that downtime, and I can see where mental health plays quite a big role for people who are particularly creative, because it's when you're not in that zone, it can be a little bit boring. It can be very boring, and if you are experiencing a lot of difficulty, if you're prone to anxiety and depression, which I'm sure a lot of people are, I know that I've had those episodes in the past, they're things that actually the creative process helps to manage. And so being busy at the right level can really, really help, as long as you're being true to what it is that you want to be achieving, and you don't overdo it, and you don't run yourself down to the ground in the sort of manic episode. I think it can be really positive to have a few plates spinning, because you can move from one to the other. And I'm quite a firm believer in the sort of same as an ecosystem benefits from diversity, I think your inner ecosystem benefits too. So if you've got a nice fertile edge between tea and philosophy and music and your daily work, interesting things can pop up between those edges. That's a sort of permaculture kind of theme, which is the edge principle, where that's the most fertile place. Where the sea meets the land is ultimately the most fertile place. And so, yeah, I find that helps a lot. So I like to have the right level of busy, but you can tip over into complete mania if you're not careful.
Fully, yeah. I mean, I don't know if you noticed this as well, like getting that balance right. With philosophy and music are great examples of two things that just seem at completely opposite ends of some spectrum. So they've got a different feeling to me, like a different mental feeling. When I'm doing philosophy intensely, which I usually I'll sit and do 2 or 3 hours of writing, for example, before I really feel I need to break off. But that feels very different to, say, sitting at a piano and do it and just playing. And that again feels very different to what I do at Lush, which is talking to people, which I really enjoy doing, but I find that I'm exhausted from that much sooner than I would be either of the others. But they feel different, is my only point. So I think you can train yourself to notice that feeling tone to each of those different things and know when it's too much. It's just a matter of training.
I think, and I think they're like different rooms in your house. Do you know what I mean? And I think if you've got, and I like the concept of, you're not going to decorate every room the same in your house. You're not going to paint the walls white, and each room's got a different feeling and a different kind of space. And I think it's just the same within your mind. I think you can go. I quite like going into, the perfume room is very different from the ecosystem restoration room. But then there's lots of benefits and overlaps and things that you can apply and forwards as well if you're careful. So I agree. You definitely have a feeling.
Well, I'm very cautious of your time. I'm very grateful for it as well. I know you need to get off. So where can people find you online, I guess, or in person?
Well, I've got all sorts of different bits, but you've got andfragrance.com, which is the fragrance side of my work at the minute, and we're just about to be able to go live with the full range. Probably in the next 2 weeks we'll have the packaging, so nice. There's an offering of fragrances. I'm on Instagram with Gorilla, so you can follow some updates and progress there. And then Careys Secret Garden.co.uk is the garden project, which should be unveiled properly in the spring next year. So yeah, I've got a lot of exciting things going on.
Plenty there. Nice. I'll get those all in the show notes. Well, thank you very much for coming in, and let's do this again sometime. It was great.
Been brilliant. Thank you very much.